So, welcome back, everyone. We go on to the nitty-gritty details, nuts and bolts of public procurement. And we have a number of them, starting from technical specifications and so on. Let's just wait for the last people. I just need to remind everyone, including myself, that we are supposed to sign attendance sheet every day. Otherwise, you will not get your travel paid by your organization or whatever. So it's in your interest. Yeah, it's also for reporting.
And it's also for the ETCS point certification.
Yeah, exactly.
So just make sure
so
that
that's just incredibly important. Sì. No, boh, non lo so. Okay, so let's start with technical specifications. This is the same image that Martin had on one of his slide, and as Martin was saying very clearly, we are focusing at supranational level. One thing that could be added and might be relevant in some context, and Natasha will work on this, is not just the GPA, it might be bilateral trade agreements or multilateral trade agreements, but also in many developing countries, it is donors, and they focus on the world stage because it's where you can have discrimination. And this is our stage is, as Martin was saying, about whom we buy from, but the starting point, technical specification is you need to write down in a transparent way. This will need to be advertised, transparency, your desiderata, what you want to buy. So, for instance, according to the GPA, technical specification, they lay down the characteristics of goods and services.
Everyone knows what GPA is by now.
Yes. First session, Martin. Yeah. It's always important. And what is the problem often is also terminology, because we might describe differently the same kind of chair. So all these things go into technical specifications. Article 42 of the directive is already going into more details, adding the extra layer of sustainability and different aspects of sustainability. So, for instance, process or method of production. How much energy goes in producing your chair, your desk? Is it made of sustainable wood, or is it just any kind of materials? And of course, IP rights, you already know they are important, and accessibility requirements. Marta, please.
So can I write, I want the most environmentally friendly chair in my technical specification? Is that okay?
No.
Why not?
Because it is not objective and clearly delineated enough. you can write that you want certified sustainable wood and add, for instance, under the Forestry Stewardship Council or equivalent, but not just saying, I want the most green thing. Martin and me, we are boys, so we like our instances on tanks, submarines. I can't write, I want the greenest possible tank. Of course, it will be painted green. They are normally painted green, but it's not really objective enough. You need something that is objective, something that is measurable. Of course, this is the part of the lawyers, and then you will need people having the technical knowledge, engineers, specialists in different materials, actually drafting the technical specifications. I could just distinguish between milk and semi-skimmed milk, but no more details than that. What is the approach? The approach might be either very descriptive or look at to the purpose, what you are buying this for, the function. And this is very important. For instance, in the old times, including here, we were buying photocopiers. And so we were looking at very specific machines making so many copies. These days, we buy photocopying services. We just tell them that we want about so many photocopies per day, per hour, and we want our machines to be running. Well, it's actually no more our machines, it's the supplier machines. So you think in terms of functions, and again, a GPA EU directive, and there is a mistake, of course, it's not 2017, no idea, it's 2014. Is it not even fat finger, because it can't be so fat? But there is this idea that you must avoid narrowing it to avoid competition with the limits that Marta will be describing when she will be speaking about Concordia bus. There is this word intention, which shouldn't be there, but the politicians put it there, because intention is something from criminal law. Purpose is the same idea. You need not to discriminate, but it's the same in many member states. In many legal orders, the principle of non-discrimination. You must not treat differently. No. You must not treat differently the same situation. But you can treat differently different situations. So going back to Marta's instance, you can't say, I want a sustainable chair. But you can say, I want sustainable wood, certified sustainable wood chairs, even if these will disadvantage certain economic operators. But I'm sure the lawyers have already seen the beautiful legal word in my slide, which is the beautiful legal word in my slide. No, intention shouldn't be there. Unduly. Meaning that in some case, you might have the intention of favoring or disadvantaging not so much certain specific, but certain categories of suppliers. You want to buy an electric car. And until a few years ago, you were disadvantages our local touring producers because they were a little bit late in uptaking electric cars. But this is not unduly. What makes it duly or unduly? Well, it must be specified for sure, but the point is whether the distinction you are creating is answering a legitimate policy objective. So there is a dirty word in public procurement. The dirtiest word in public procurement, kids cover your ears, no kids anyway, is local. You can't write, I want local strawberries. That's against everything we believe or we pretend to believe because we are part of a church, the public procurement church. Local is not good, but bio strawberries, of course.
Seasonal?
Seasonal strawberries in Copenhagen in December.
Yeah.
And no, sorry. No, there might be seasonable is sensible. Why seasonable is sensible?
Objective.
First is objective. And second, it means that you are not thinking in terms of local, but in terms of supply chain. And seasonable, normally, there was this beautiful a case, it was commissioned against Denmark, I don't remember the number, about saplings. They wanted to plant some nice trees like beaches, I don't remember the name, and they asked for grown in Denmark saplings. And they said, oh, but okay, this is legitimate because we want our trees. You know, if the trees come from Italy and then they are exposed to the frigid Danish winter, I don't want to think about that, poor Federica. But yes, but do you think that the winter is less frigid in Sweden? No. So the objective and legitimate would be what? Seasoned to cold climate samplings, not Danish. Okay, so this is what is duly, what is not duly. And of course, this is just the introduction. And you put two lawyers in one room with enough to drink, and they can go on forever arguing whether something is duly or unduly. Okay, so you have the extremes, we agree. The more you go to the middle, the more there is room for discussion. Qualification, very fast. And here we are really from whom we are buying. And of course, there is the non-discrimination thing, but there is the reliability issue. There was this interesting debate before we can continue on this. Do we really think that commercial buyers are incapable of buying decent spare parts, decent materials, without putting a notice in the official journal? Of course not. But we are doing public procurement. And so, again, the top reliability, as Marta was saying before, is my buddy. I know him. If the person selling is my wife, is even better. I know her. I know her to be reliable in what she sells, but it's discriminatory.
Can I just add to it? Because I think we very often use this example in a very prerogative way, meaning that if you would want to buy from someone that you know or previous contractor that you had a relationship with, etc., it needs to be underlined with negatives, meaning corruption, meaning giving someone bribes or something that wouldn't work. But at the same time, it could be also why it's still, the argumentation is irrelevant, it's still illegal. But the notion behind it can actually be objective. And what I mean by that, for example, local, very often, it not necessarily needs to mean preferential treatment to someone that I know, but it can mean transparency. I exactly know from where that carrot comes. I know how it's grown. I can go and check it, that it's really sustainable. I have a full knowledge about the supply chain of the things that I buy because it is local. The moment that your supply chain becomes very long and goes very far away from home, you lose a certain level of transparency. And that's what we then try to, within a proper documentation and requirements, really enforce, right? But that is, again, to not demonize all of it, but also see it really in a commercial market circumstances. Now, this is, again, not an excuse that just because you have a good reason you can buy local. But I'm just trying to show you that because often the suppliers, when you would talk to them, they don't understand what is our problem. And they saying, well, it's not corruptive behavior, right? But this is sort of putting it in a, again, broader perspective.
Yeah, I think, and this is interesting from the effectiveness point of view, because in public procurement, we are so scared of corruption, probably rightly so in most countries, that we pile rule upon rule, and we tend to lose effectiveness. And we take the lawyer's approach. Lawyer's approach is that you need to have general objective provisions. So we translate reliability, which is honestly is more an instinct than a science, into some rules, which is what I will go to immediately. First, non-discrimination. Well, non-discrimination if you are in the club. If you are outside of the club, you can be discriminated. And that's why the GPA is important. But then you should go into the coverage of the GPA that is totally complicated to see whether you are in the club for that procurement or whether you are not.
Can I just add to,
Of
because
course.
we had a question in chat from previous session, and that was this aspect whether you can discriminate against third country suppliers. And this is just a sideline, I think, important and ties nicely to what you said. We have the rules that when you go outside of these EU rules that we predominantly discuss here today, the argument has been made for a long time right now that we need to ensure within European market, the internal market, a level playing field between the competition for our companies, the European companies, and the companies coming from outside. So if that is Brazil, US, China, etc., do they play by the same rules as our companies have to? So a quite standard example here that is being given is, for example, we might have a very stringent rules on environmental protection, on health and safety, etc., which is associated with cost. So the Italian company needs to include that cost within their bids. But if we at the same time have a company, for example, from China competing, and that company's day regulation are not as stringent, potentially, this is just strictly theoretical, right? And they automatically, their cost of manufacturing of particular things are lower. So that company have a competitive advantage of winning the bid. But how we then ensuring that the particular compliance of legal matters such as environmental health and safety, etc., is obeyed. And what happens is that particularly right now with the international procurement instrument that has been negotiated for extended time, and finally we seem to have some sort of traction there, there is right now idea, a proposal that has been rediscussed many times, that if you are from a country that does not have a trading agreement with EU, you can be discriminated against within the procurement in EU. So that is to be considered as leveling playing field. Is that making sense to everyone? Or not really? So it's again all about this trading agreements. Are you part of the club of what Roberto mentioned, or are you out? If you're out, well, the rules don't apply to you anymore. Then we can discriminate because we might have a good reason to do so, right?
So we can discriminate. We don't need to discriminate. So for instance, UK used to be so much focused on value for money that they didn't care where their stuff was coming from. The cheapest, the best, who cares? Other countries in the EU, we Italian, we don't know, we know that we can't discriminate against the French. Oh, today we can discriminate against the Brits, I guess. For sure, we can discriminate against those from Algeria, you name it. So non-discrimination, but within the EU. And again, this is for the non-lawyers here. Law is traditionally territorial. Economics, as far as I'm told, is about reason. Every reasonable person on the planet and reasonable aliens would come to the same conclusion. No. Law is territorial. You cross the border and the law changes. What is allowed in one place is not allowed in another place. So this is, please, a question. Just spell out your name, please. No, as you say, it is the bidder, Valentina, meaning the person, the company normally that is selling this stuff to you. The content might be more complicated because the content, if you are talking about goods procurement, then it doesn't go under the procurement rules, it goes under the World Trade Organization rules. And World Trade Organization has a much wider let's say, participation than not the GPA. So your supplier, provided that it is established in one EU country, might sell you stuff coming from Vietnam, provided that both Vietnam and the specific good is covered under the WTO, which is totally complicated.
But also, Valentina, if you're interested in it, I would really recommend looking into this international procurement instrument, because if I remember from top of my head, and don't quote me directly on it, but I believe that when it comes to procurement of goods, you can, as a member state, as a contracting authority, ask specifically when those goods are manufactured. And if they are manufactured, I think above 20% outside of EU, you can sort of put a fee. You kind of try up to again some percentages to equalize with the other European suppliers. So I know that at least one of the versions of international procurement instrument were predicting that.
Yes. So kind of price adjustment, if you want, but this goes under the, let's say, WTO, because of course this price adjustment must be legitimate from the point of view of WTO, because WTO is the son of GATT, and GATT started with the general agreement on tariffs, and this price preference, they become kind of tough. It's totally complicated. There will be need for many, let's say 3 years for you to really gouge fully.
For you to give us the answer ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. When we see each other in 3 years, you will give us the updated, by the way, because things are going to change. How do we measure reliability? We have two mechanisms. First is exclusion grounds, and the other is qualification criteria. Exclusion grounds is the idea that you don't want to do business with everyone. So both the GPA and the directive, you have long lists of contractors you don't want to deal with because of terrorism. Doesn't happen, honestly, in public procurement. But fraud, wow. Fraud can happen often enough, or semi-mandatory. I don't want to go into the detail, just consider that this is a little bit different from the first one. Payment of taxes or social security contribution. You want to avoid here unfair competition. Of course, if I don't pay taxes, my price will be lower. If I don't pay social security contribution, my cost will be lower. I will transfer to you part of my saving, which, if you want, is perfect from the point of view of best value for money. But this means that you are honestly creating problems somewhere else. Sooner or later, there will be no money to do the next procurement because no one is paying taxes. Because if this is the game, why I should pay? And the same with social contribution. Of course, and we go back to the point that Marta was raising. This is the internal market. It is 27 member states. Well, taxes in Italy are not the same that taxes in Ireland. Taxes in Italy are not paid let's say, as consistently, it's a gentle way to put it, as I'm told in Denmark. I just was shocked. I did one conference in Uppsala, and they were so kind to reimburse my plane ticket. And the year after, I got a letter in Swedish from the Swedish tax authority in asking me to explain why I got that money and where I paid taxes on that. And it was kind of 200 euros. Where do you can insist? If you are a contracting authority in Italy, you can't insist that a company from Ireland pay the tax rates that we have in Italy. It is enough for them to pay taxation due in Ireland. Of course, what is the problem? And again, like Martin, I put myself in the poor procurement official in the small municipality of Cairo Montenotto. How do I know whether they have paid in Ireland or not? And that's why the EU is slowly creating a system enabling the transfer of this kind of information. And then there are non-mandatory. Non-mandatory depends on the country. If you are in a Catholic country, maybe with the exception of Belgium, but I'm not 100% sure, everything is mandatory. If you are in the, let's say, Ireland, they decide whether they care about grave professional misconduct, collusion. Marta will be also speaking, but it was also already mentioned before, like equal pay, like the respect of workers' right, or they really don't care. A new thing, self-cleaning. There is this possibility you did badly and you solve a little bit the situation. There is a beautiful, most beautiful video when you want to know about corruption in international public procurement. It's a video about Siemens. Siemens used to bribe its way to all contracts outside Germany. It was normal. It was even tax deductible. Yes, of course.
Leave Martin alone at this point,
Sorry.
Roberto.
No, but okay, I leave it. The point is that there is self-cleaning. Siemens fired all the top brass, a good portion of the middle brass, to go on and do procurement. I don't know what Volkswagen did, but I don't want to insist on this. So there are exclusion grounds, but you might, in a way, be spared if you repent. Please. Your name, sorry. No, but just.
I will just repeat the question for
Yes,
the
please.
Zoom. The question was whether the non-mandatory exclusions, is that at the discretion of the contracting authority or at the state level?
It is two stages. If the states decide it is mandatory, like Italy, it is mandatory. If the states leave discretion to the contracting authority, then it's each contracting authority. You might have a different approach.
And one more question to this. There is a fair bit of discussion within the chat room about transparency of supply chain. So when you're using these different exclusion. Is the main issue ultimately the lack of transparency, or is it simplifying the problem within the supply chains, right? So how are you able as a contracting authority to really ultimately find out whether there is corruption, whether there is terrorism, whether there is not paying of social securities, etc., particularly if it takes you, if the supply chain is quite long and takes you outside of EU, for example?
Yeah, that's the bigger problem, and what the EU can help only up to a point. Sharing information within the EU, this is possible. Outside is more difficult. Transparency is the issue. How do you address or start addressing the issues? The issue. One thing is labels. You have a certification system. You rely on some labels. So, for instance, the sustainable forestry? No. The Forestry Stewardship Council. That's about wood. And you know, wood for your desk. You have no idea of where the wood is coming. And it might come from forests that should not be logged. And you are again the small procuring official in Quincinetto. And how can you know? Can you fly to Borneo to look at the trees at the chimpanzee? You would like it, but it doesn't make sense cost-wise. So you rely on the Forestry Stewardship Council that are providing certificates or similar kind of organization. There are a lot of very, very, very interesting experiences in Sweden, what is now called ADA, their central purchasing body. They are actually making audit, including at times on-spot audit. But of course, this is the central purchasing body for the whole Sweden. So it can think of flying one person for a couple of weeks to Borneo. Okay? And please, if you want to add... yes, fast. Sorry. There is one incredibly important thing, but Marta will be talking about that. Article 18.2. We have talked about 18.1. 18.1 is you don't discriminate unduly. 18.2, but you insist that these obligations are complied with, and this is about fair competition. How do you make sure, well, insist it's only a ground for non-mandatory exclusion at EU level, probably because they are aware that it's not so easy to assess, but that is your work, the work of our PhD, finding sensible ways to make sure that this doesn't stay on paper, that the law is enforced. And so SG will be writing on contract clauses. You needed to have appropriate contract clauses. First, qualification, that's my last slide. So first was exclusion, now qualification. You look at past experience, qualified stuff, and financial standing. There is this thing, just one story, or not really about Germany, about Turin. And it was about our procurement for cleaning the street from snow during winter. And we got a nice, very cheap tender without much experience, and then disaster. And the funniest part was, okay, a lot of criticism in the press, and at the time the chairperson of this company, which was not based in Turin, saying, but here it always snows during the weekend. Oh, come on. It snows when it snows. You should have people ready to take the snow out during the weekend. But the nice thing about public procurement, well, criminal law is more fun. You have a lot of blood and interesting stories and so. But even in procurement, you will know about a great number of procurement disasters, things that went wrong totally. So thank you. And now, Mark.
And I have about 6 minutes to do with you all the award process. We can take some time with Martin. Martin's to the left, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, sounds good. So we're moving ultimately to what is probably the most important aspect of the procurement process, because everything is ultimately about the award. So until now, we talked about, well, how you inform the market and how you define what you want to buy, how you check the company, the persons that you are to contract with. And that's where more or less the step in which you're looking at who is the supplier, that step ends here. So ultimately, when we're right now moving to the award, we're not anymore interested in really looking into who the supplier is, but what is the offer. Now, a slight line to that, when you're purchasing services, you may still want to be interested in experience or particular elements connected with the company. But just on this general theme, when we're moving right now to the award criteria, everything is about the offer. So in other words, when everything is about the offer, how are we choosing the winning one? And that's where we're moving to the award criteria. And award criteria, I'm going to mainly refer again to the directive provisions, because as has been mentioned earlier on, that's where the more complex regulation is really provided, which you can benchmark to whatever you will be doing. In general, we focus on price at that stage. Now, if we look at the statistical data over the years, the challenge that we have, particularly within Sapiens project broadly, is that in 70% still of procurement, the lowest price is the only award criteria. So it is the race to the bottom, right? Now, we don't want that. We don't want that because Sideline and Martin left the room, so I can make the Sideline. I disagree with the notion that sustainability is something on top of everything, and that sustainability is something that you need to pay additionally. The problem is that if you're racing to the bottom, that means that you push the cost somewhere else. It's not that you pay more sustainably, it's that you didn't consider the true cost of what you're buying, right? And this is very much the counter-argument to the notion of the lowest price. So where the newest directive pushed slightly the agenda is that we're not anymore to talk about the lowest price, but we are to talk at least about the cost, the price-quality ratio. But what we really truly want, also within this project to move on, is to really apply across procurements across Europe the most advantageous, economically advantageous tender, right? So this is the award criteria in which we look at the price, we look at the quality in a very broad understanding of this. So for example, the elements that are sufficiently connected and objective and acceptable of an environmental or social element, they are also to be brought up to this most economically advantageous tender criteria. And that is very much what is regulated under Article 67. Now, where this takes another step further is the introduction for the first time of Article 68, which talks about life cycle costing, right? And that will be something that, again, we so much look forward to all of you who are non-lawyers working on this, because this is where we we did a book with Roberto on this, and we still don't have really answer, because we need the others of you to help us out to really push the agenda in that area. So a little bit about life cycle costing in a second. But then when it comes to this environmental or social elements, and where is the biggest limitation of what we can do within award, is this development of a concept of a link to subject matter of the contract. And that will provide our limits to what we can and cannot do, really. So that's a broad run through this. And what are the award criteria, what they can relate to? So they can relate to the quality and how we understand quality. Well, those can be technical merits. They can be functional characteristics. They can be social, environmental, innovation characteristics, etc., etc. Again, as long as they link to the subject matter of the contract. Organization, qualification, and experience of staff. When it comes to those who are assigned to performing of a contract. So that's particularly related, again, to the services, right? And then we also can look at delivery conditions or after-sale services, maintenance, etc., etc. So that gives you some examples, more or less, of what we're talking about. But now where the dog is, so to speak, buried, what every person did research in sustainable public procurement sort of has, well, if we only didn't have that bit, life would be much easier. And that is this concept of link to the subject matter of the contract. So what happened until this very infamous case, the landmark case for all of us in this room, Concordia Bus, is the argument until then was very pessimistic about including anything that very narrowly understood economic consideration within public procurement. It's a Finnish case where Helsinki was procuring buses, and they wanted to consider the noise levels and the CO2 emissions of the buses, the whole sort of environmental output. And of course, who didn't want the bid got a bit upset, and they say this is not something that is allowed. The procedure has been challenged and went all the way to the European Court of Justice. And what we get out of this case is this concept. So we can consider if those are environmental criteria, which directly follow from this case, but this is equally applicable to social criteria. We can consider them within procurement process if A, they're suitable for objective evaluation. This is standard. This is what Roberto Martin was mentioning earlier on, right? Whatever you consider in procurement, it needs to be suitable and objective. You need to ensure transparency. So you informed about those criteria at the contract notice at the very beginning, right? Because that can impact if me as a supplier, if I want to bid for it or not. It needs to be non-discriminatory. So all this, after these 2-3 sessions that we right now have, this should sound familiar. And what was the new addition is it needs to be linked to the subject matter of the contract. Now, what that means, and that is very much connected with the notion of public procurement being a relationship, contractual relationship between two parties. And you can only focus and only ask about things that are related to that relationship. So, practical example. I can ask you to provide the chairs or tables, if we go back to that example, to be made out of recyclable wood. But I cannot ask you for you to be a company that has its whole manufacturing based on recycled materials. I cannot ask you verify what you will do outside of this contract. So I purposely over-exaggerate right now, but I'm interested that you don't breach human rights under my contract. But I cannot really ask you what you do outside, or I cannot try to force you to be a good company outside of that contractual relationship. Is that making sense? And that provides us with this limitation of what you can do within linked to the subject matter. And since introduction of this for many years, ultimately the legal interpretation of what we do as an academics within this field very much has been how far I can stretch this, how sort of palatable this concept is, what it includes or not. So for example, for many years we had this question, if we're going with the tables or chairs, can I ask or require a particular method of production? Because I will not see the method of production when I buy actually the chairs or table, right? It's sort of invisible. So is that related or not? And that's when the second case that also is very important in context of sustainable public procurement, the so-called Dutch coffee case. So it's Commission versus Netherlands about sustainable coffee, ethical trade. But for purpose of specifically this session, what really came out of that case is this notion of reaffirming that we actually can consider the specific processes of production, trading of the work services, the processes and every stage of a life cycle ultimately of the products that we buy, particularly when goods. So this is the moment in which, so to speak, the link to the subject matter expanded a little bit. We had a confirmation that it includes several of the elements.
And this is really very, very important. This idea of material substance was kind of nonsense. Was the idea that is only what you can touch is linked to the subject matter, which for goods is debatable. But think the material substance of services. What is the material substance? This was the Court of Justice, but was also the Commission trying to limit what you could do and exclude production process, as Marta was saying, because the Commission was worried that referring to production process would create room for discrimination. I think it was a training in Trier a few years ago, no, many years ago, before Directive 2014, and there was an attachment of what was possible in technical specifications. It was an attachment, and then there was production process. And I was telling to the person from the Commission, listen, it's already written in the directive. And she was saying, shh, don't talk about this. It's totally crazy.
Roberto, just a couple questions from chat. I'm fully aware that we late. Just bear with us, Martin, for a sec. One question is, well, can we talk a little bit more, explain a little bit more what we mean by subject matter? What a subject matter is? That's my first question that I just sort of read from the chat. And second question is, how this what we're discussing right now about this very contractual kind of based, relationship based, what is only within procurement relates or differs with exclusion grounds, that obviously you're looking on something outside.
Two great points. The first one on contract design. And I have my instance, which is a real instance from France. They wanted to do some maintenance and restoration works to an old fortress, and they wanted to train long-term unemployed people. There is no rule that one contract must have only one object. A contract can have different objects or subject matters. What is important is that this is not done in a way to avoid the application of EU rules, And of course, there are specific provisions in the directive. I think it's Article 11, but I'm not 100% sure, so you can correct me, about mixed contracts. You can have contracts that are for some part works, for some part services, and so on and so forth. They can be part concessions and part procurement. So this, I think, is a kind of, let's say, a mirror to a full people. I design the contract as I want, possibly achieving more than one objective. Of course, not just to cheat on EU rules. So this is the first point, but you can elaborate further, or Martin, on this. Second point was, yeah, exclusion is not a link to the subject matter, if not for some proportionality issue. Exclusion is about reliability. Think you are in a romantic relationship. A person cheating on you once, is he or she reliable? Oh, I only did it once. If the, forget about terrorism, but if it was already fraud, no, I don't trust you. And fraud, it is necessarily on the past and on the company. It can't be on the contract. The contract is yet to be awarded. How can you have been already fraudulent on a contract that has not yet been awarded? So the limit there, I think, is not so much the link to the subject matter to the contract. It might be a bit the proportionality principle. Yes, there was a grave breach of contract, a grave professional misconduct, but that was about a small contract 7 years ago. And this is, if you want, proportionality is the mother or father, I don't know, of self-cleaning. Yes, I did something wrong. I don't think it works in romantic relationship, but I don't know, you decide. It's very personal. But in procurement, the idea is that you can come clean again. And there is no link to the subject matter, because you want someone that is reliable and has not committed a number of offenses, mandatory, or a number of misdemeanors that you consider relevant. Thanks you, both great questions.
Sure. You want to answer? Martin, you got a microphone here.
This is going to be a nice debate.
Yes, so the question was about how we ultimately defining the subject matter of the contract. Can I say I don't want to buy particular, let's say, chair, but it is to be produced in an ethical way. It is to be produced in a sustainable way. You look into actually how the company acts. And Martin was very keen to jump on.
I wonder whether perhaps the decision of the Court of Justice in the case of EVN Wienstrom.
Yes, so we're referring right now to the case.
Perhaps you were kind of hinting at that. What you had in this case was that the city of Vienna in Austria was procuring energy. And the question basically decided there was, can they require sustainable energy with respect to the energy that the city of Vienna is procuring through this contract? Absolutely. But can they also say, because an energy supplying company will supply public contractors, but also private parties in various parts. So can they also say, no, we're not just talking about the contract that we're procuring here. We are looking at your whole business, even when you supply energy to, I don't know, Austrian Airways or to any kind of Volkswagen, to any kind of private company. And we want all your energy that you produce to be sustainable. That is actually how I understand to a large extent the word related to the subject matter of the contract, that the first related to the subject matter of the contract is the energy that the city of Vienna is buying itself. Not related to the subject matter of the contract is the energy that it produces for all its other supply contracts. I think that's the main, which of course partly kills or very much limits the use of public procurement as an instrument to change the world. Because if you could say the second, if you didn't have the requirement of subject matter of the contract, you could influence so much more.
And at the risk of complicating that further, this Dutch coffee case that we have right now on the slide, it also refers very much to contract performance conditions, to which I'm going to hopefully soon get to. But it also relates to this notion of what you can actually consider a subject matter of your contract. So up there being an issue of ethical trading, right? Wanting to buy coffee that has been ethically traded. And they written it out in technical specifications. And the Court of Justice came and say, this is not something that fulfills the requirement of what technical specification is. You can consider that, but later on in the contract performance condition. And that element is also very interesting because we had a conversation with Roberto about it. What about sustainably grown trees? Can that then be something that is part of technical specification on the other hand, right? And the issue here also where it becomes quite interesting because a lot of criticism to this Dutch coffee case came from many environmental and social NGOs because they said, you right now not regulating how we procure with this judgment, but you're regulating what we buy. This ultimately impacts because we were interested to define exactly to your point that this is what we want to buy. It's not something to be added on, but this is what we want to buy, right? And the court says, well, it's not that simple. You actually need to go into deeper layers to find out whether it is suitable to define that. Roberto?
One small point, and then we see how many questions we can take. You will be staying in Sapiens for 3 years. So you don't need to ask all the questions this morning. But if it is important, of course, you are most welcome to ask questions. Just one point, what you could do under Article 20 of the directive, you could decide to reserve your procurement to some, let's say, deserving organization, for instance, for workshop for unemployed, workshop for disabled, and so on and so forth. And this is a specific provision you have in the directive. Your own procurement, I don't, this is a limit to the non-discrimination principle or an exception to the non-discrimination principle. And then there are the special regime for social and other services where you can reserve your procurement to the non-profit organizations, basically. I have seen 3 hands.
We would take it during a break. Bear with us, okay? Just so we can get through this because I'm worried that Martin will get quite upset in a second. We will take whole time of or you will not have time for lunch, which then you will get upset. We'll come back to that. So just remember those questions, and I'm more than happy to have a chat also during a break. But then, so award criteria, I mentioned, introduce this provision on life cycle costing. This is something that I think that also the economist will get excited about, because life cycle analysis, all these different things, this is something that you actually know what to do with it. We got introduction of this provision. Why we're very excited about it within sustainable public procurement, because this ultimately very clearly says you are to consider cost throughout all the stages. And that very much also challenges the notion of asking within procurement of the cheapest price, because the cheapest price and solo price is very much has been understood as a acquisition price. So the price that I'm getting today for goods or services today, right? But have I considered how much it will cost to maintain? The light bulbs are, again, standard example, right? I can buy a really cheap light bulb today, but then the amount of energy that light bulb will consume will increase the cost of that contract. The need for maintenance exchanges of those light bulbs will contribute to that, and then not even to mention how I dispose that. Versus if I would put more attention to it and buy a proper energy efficiency light bulb at the very beginning, the acquisition cost is higher, but in the longevity of a contract, I'm going to save money, right? And life cycle costing is very much connected with that. It's very much connected into also this total cost of ownership way of thinking. But where the life cycle costing becomes particularly, I think, fascinating and important, and when we're hoping that you really will help us in the next years to move that conversation forward, is the type of cost that we can consider and the methodology about it, because we are also in life cycle costing talking about external costs. So the cost, particularly to environment, that are associated with the purchases that we make. And then how the methodology looks like, because this is, I think, also what is interesting right now to economists, because we very specifically have written into the law how that methodology is to look like to a certain extent, or what requirement it needs to fulfill. And now the question is that the people that actually do those methodologies, if they find that this can work, and to what extent, right? Because the methodology needs to be based on objective, verifiable, non-discriminatory criteria. It should be ultimately established for repeated need, accessible to all interested parties. Well, what that really means, do I need to pay for it? Is that accessible enough or not? And then the data required is to be provided with reasonable effort, but normally diligent economic operators. So that's paraphrasing the proportionality principle here, et cetera, et cetera. So the rules on life cycle costing are quite interesting. And also life cycle costing truly in European public procurement is crawling. They don't even try to stand up. We looked a lot over the last couple of years, and usually we don't, even if contracting authorities or commission refers to life cycle costing, it's not life cycle costing that they use. It's maybe total cost of ownership, but they do not look to the externality. So we really need some development in that area. And then the last point that I wanted to make to sort of loop all this process, because there is definite relationship between those three elements: the qualification that we discussed when we look at the suppliers, the award criteria when we look at the offer, and then what happens with contract performance condition. Contract performance condition used to be something that you really wanted to have, but from different reasons you considered that that's not something to be a part of a competitive element of the procurement. So it was, again, one of those things, not that it would be nice to have, but you're just putting it in your contract, and in a contractual clause, and you're saying whoever wins needs to fulfill this. And there are, again, rules connected with that. because you need to inform about those contract performance conditions from the very beginning of the market. Because let's say if you're going to say you actually need to employ at least 10 people on your contract from long-term unemployed, you can imagine that that can increase the cost for a company. So they need to consider whether that's reasonable, if they want to bid or not. What was very interesting also under old directive was that this was the only provision that was sort of sustainable, like where you didn't have this requirement of link to the subject matter. That was our gate. You could put a lot of things there, but that's not anymore the case with the newest directive. We have the link to the subject matter of a contract there. And then there is also a question on how much independence they have. Whether those contract performance conditions needs to be directly related to what you write in technical specification, what you consider in award criteria, how much they can stand outside. And the last point is that there are many different types of contract performance conditions. Something that could be particularly interesting for those of you that will look in innovation and technology. We don't have much information on how contract performance conditions are used to propagate innovation. Because even that the article on contract performance conditions refers to the notion that elements such as environmental, social, and innovation can be considered, majority of the examples that we're being given are from environmental and social nature. So they can reflect to environmental elements, particularly what type of let's say recycling or delivery methods that are environmentally friendly you are to obey by, but also social performance conditions, and that is a recital 98 that you have there that have this direct link to equality of women and men, right? They're using it as a contract performance condition. This is looping this whole thing together. You should have 5 million questions. That's great. That means that you're listening and you're interested. We're going to go straight away to the case by Martin, and then we have a lunch break. So if you have following questions, you're more than welcome to have a chat with us. And to people on Zoom, I will sit right now in the chat, so I will try to reply to some of the comments. So that's it from us.